She thought she was saving a dying enemy soldier to ease her conscience for one cold night, but she had no idea that single act would rewrite her family's destiny forever. In the dead of a Tennessee winter, Ivy opened her door to a man bleeding in the snow, unaware she was inviting in a future full of love, loss, and impossible second chances. What began as mercy became a life rebuilt from ashes, a home reborn, and a love story no one saw coming. You won't believe how it all unfolds. The wind howled over the barren hills of eastern Tennessee, tugging at the loose boards of the cottage that stood stubbornly against the elements. Ivy McAllister braced herself against the creaking door frame, shielding her eyes as she watched her two sons, Caleb and Jonah, wrestle with a frozen water barrel outside. Their small hands were red from the cold, but they worked with the kind of silent determination that made her chest ache with pride and guilt. It had been 6 months since Nathan, her husband, had ridden off to war in his Union blues with a stiff smile and tighter jaw. He hadn't wanted to go, not really, but the pressure from the town, from his own conscience, had been more than he could bear. "Just a few months," he had said, holding her face between calloused palms. "I'll be home by harvest." But the harvest had come and gone, and with it any word from him. Not a letter, not a rumor, just silence thick as grief, growing heavier with every passing day. Ivy pulled her shawl tighter, the wool scratchy against her neck. The cottage behind her groaned under the weight of a new snowfall. Their food stores were low, the firewood pile dwindling, and the hens had stopped laying weeks ago. She had begun stretching meals with acorn flour and boiled bark. Her boys had never once complained, but their eyes were thinner now, their laughter shorter. Caleb, at 11, had taken to sleeping near the hearth with one hand wrapped protectively around Jonah, only 7. Ivy often woke to find them like that, curled into each other, weathering another storm together. "Mama, it's frozen solid," Caleb called, panting with effort. "I'll fetch the kettle," Ivy answered, stepping back inside the cramped cottage. The fire spat and hissed, barely more than glowing coals now. She added a pinch of dried pine needles to the iron pot, hoping the scent would trick them into feeling warmer. She was lifting the kettle to pour when she heard it. A low groan, almost like the wind, but deeper, more human. Her spine stiffened. She glanced out the window, but saw only trees and snow. Then again, the sound closer now, unmistakable. "Mama?" Jonah was at her side, his eyes wide. "Stay inside. Lock the door." Ivy moved quickly, grabbing the rusted rifle from above the mantel. It hadn't fired clean in years, but it was something. She stepped onto the porch, snow crunching underfoot, the cold biting at her ankles. She followed the sound around the side of the house and stopped short. A man lay half buried in the snow beside the barn, his uniform tattered, boots torn, blood trailing behind him in the snow like some terrible red ribbon. He looked barely conscious, one hand outstretched toward the house as if he had crawled the last few feet. "Dear Lord," Ivy whispered. His face was smeared with mud and blood, dark beard crusted with frost. But it was his uniform that caught her breath, a Confederate gray, faded and threadbare, the brass buttons dulled, a rebel. She took a cautious step back, torn between fear and pity. The war had left them with little more than ghosts and rumors. A wounded soldier on her land, enemy or not, was a risk. Harboring him could mean prison, or worse. But then he groaned again, a low sound of pain that cracked through her fear like lightning across a night sky. "Mama!" Caleb had followed her, rifle in hand, his eyes hard. "Should I get the sheriff?" Ivy looked down at the man, barely clinging to life, then at her son, standing too straight for his age. "No," she said finally. "Help me bring him inside." They dragged him through the snow, careful not to jostle the wound in his side. It had soaked his shirt dark, the cloth stiff and frozen. His breath came in shallow gasps, and more than once Ivy thought he'd die right there on their floor. But she couldn't let that happen. Not while he still had warmth in him, not while there was still breath in his body. "Get my sewing kit," she ordered Caleb, "and the whiskey. We're going to need it." The next hours passed in a haze of blood and stitches, Jonah crying softly in the corner while Caleb held the lantern high. Ivy's fingers moved quickly, efficiently. Years of mending clothes and patching wounds on livestock suddenly turned toward saving a man's life. She boiled rags, poured whiskey over the gaping wound, and bit back nausea as she probed for the bullet. It was lodged deep near the rib cage, and when she finally pulled it free with a grunt of effort, the man spasmed violently, then went still. "Is he dead?" Jonah whispered. Ivy pressed a hand to the stranger's throat. The pulse was faint, but steady. Not yet. They moved him to the boy's cot, the only one strong enough to hold his weight, and covered him with every blanket they had. The cabin smelled of blood and sweat and old smoke. Ivy washed her hands in silence, the water in the basin turning pink. That night she slept on the floor beside him, one ear tuned to his ragged breathing. She didn't know his name, didn't know what crimes he might have committed, only that he was here now, broken and human, and she had chosen to save him. It was 3 days before he opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling first, then turned his head slowly, wincing as pain lit his face. His gaze found Ivy where she sat by the hearth, mending Jonah's coat. "You're awake," she said softly. He tried to speak, but his lips were cracked, his voice too dry. She crossed the room, lifted a tin cup of water to his lips. He drank greedily, then coughed, the motion tearing at his side. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, setting the cup down. His eyes, green, she realized, met hers. Intelligent eyes, watchful. "You stitched me," he rasped. "Yes." "Why?" Ivy folded her hands in her lap, unsure how to answer. "Because I couldn't let you die in the snow." He stared at her for a long time, then nodded once, as though accepting a private truth. "I'm Corporal Jameson Boyd," he said after a beat. "4th Tennessee Cavalry, Ivy McAllister." He glanced around the small cabin, his brow furrowed. "This your place?" "Yes, my husband. He's gone." Jameson's gaze lingered on the boys, now sitting quietly near the fire. "Yours?" "Yes." He didn't ask more, didn't apologize for his uniform or his past, just lay back against the pillows, his face pale with effort. The days that followed were quiet but tense. Ivy changed his bandages, fed him broth, and kept her boys close. Jameson, though weak, was never ungrateful. He said little, but always with kindness. He never reached for the rifle she'd placed across the mantel in plain view, never tried to leave. Caleb, initially wary, began to ask questions. Jonah, with the innocence of the young, asked more. "Did you fight in the big battles? Were you ever scared? Do you have a horse?" Jameson answered when he could, his voice growing stronger with each passing day. He spoke of muddy trenches, of cold camps, of a war that had broken more than it had built. But he never glorified it, never painted himself a hero. And Ivy watched the change, the way Caleb began sitting closer, how Jonah brought him carved animals, how Jameson, despite the pain, would ruffle their hair or share stories from books he'd once read. He was healing, not just in body, but in spirit. And something else was healing, too. The hollowness in their home, once filled only by absence and silence, was now warmed by quiet conversation, soft laughter, a presence that had begun to matter. Weeks passed. Winter melted to early spring. The snow gave way to mud, then green shoots. Ivy planted the first seeds in the garden, her hands in the earth, her heart uncertain. Jameson had begun walking with a cane, determined to regain his strength. He helped Caleb repair the chicken coop, taught Jonah to whittle. He never overstepped, never took a father's place, but still the boys began looking at him like a compass, like a man who would never walk away. The first time he called her Ivy, something fluttered in her chest. "Ivy," he said, standing beside her as she hung laundry in the wind, "I owe you more than I can say." "You owe me nothing," she replied, trying to keep her voice even. "That's not true. You saved my life." She met his gaze, saw the sincerity there, the quiet war behind his eyes. "You've given something back." He nodded, then looked out over the hills. "I've seen families broken by this war, seen good men turn bitter. But you've built something here, with nothing but grit and kindness." Ivy felt her throat tighten. She turned away, pretending to adjust a shirt on the line. "I only did what was right." "Yes," Jameson said quietly, "and that's rare these days." That night, as the boys drifted to sleep, Ivy found Jameson sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. She joined him, silence settling between them like an old friend. "Will you stay?" she asked at last. He looked at her, surprised. "Do you want me to?" She nodded. "The boys, they look at you like you're their hero." His jaw clenched, and she saw emotion flicker in his eyes. "And you?" he asked softly. Ivy reached for his hand, found it warm and steady. "I look at you like hope come back to life." Jameson didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hand tightened around hers, and in that quiet night, under stars that had watched their pain and now bore witness to their healing, something unspoken took root. Love, not born from fairy tales, but forged in hardship, trust, and shared silence. And though the world outside still carried its scars, within the walls of that small Tennessee cottage, a new chapter had begun. The wind shifted just before dawn, carrying with it the scent of early spring, and something Ivy hadn't smelled in months: smoke. Not the comforting kind that curled from a hearth, but the sharp tang of burning brush, the kind that meant danger or campfires too close to home. She opened her eyes slowly, still curled under a quilt on the pallet near the fire. The boys were bundled together in the corner, and Jameson Boyd sat in the rocking chair, alert despite the faint trembling in his leg. The cane leaned against the door beside him. He hadn't used it since the last thaw. He turned his head slightly when he noticed her stir. "It's west, over the ridge." "Fire?" "No," he said, his voice low. "Men, camp, scouts maybe. Too quiet for a full regiment." Ivy sat up, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. "Do you think they're looking for you?" Jameson's jaw tensed. His hand brushed the scar beneath his collarbone, one of the first she'd stitched. "Could be. Could be deserters. Could be nothing. But I'm not taking chances." He stood slowly, legs still stiff, and crossed to the stove. The warmth of the coals kissed his skin as he stirred them to life, feeding the flames with fresh kindling. "I'll go check the ridge before breakfast, see what I can see." "You're not strong enough yet." He looked over his shoulder, and she hated the way her voice trembled when she said it. Not because she didn't want him to go, but because she did. Because she knew he would. Because he was no longer just a guest in her home, no longer a burden or obligation. He had become something else entirely, her son's quiet guardian, her silent strength, her own heart's tether to the world beyond grief. "I won't be long," he said, "just enough to see what we're dealing with." He left after coffee and bread, with Caleb insisting on trailing behind him and Ivy nearly arguing them both into staying. But Jameson only rested a hand on her arm and said, "He should learn. The world's not done teaching him." They returned at noon, dusty and flushed from climbing the bluff. Caleb's eyes sparkled with the kind of adrenaline Ivy hadn't seen in him since before the war. He looked like the boy he used to be. "They're gone now," Jameson said. "Just a small group, 5 or 6. Looked like they were foraging, maybe scouting. Didn't see me." "But they saw the ridge," Ivy said, already calculating supplies, escape routes, where she could hide the boys if trouble came. "Let's not borrow worry," he said gently. "Just be ready." That night she found Jameson in the small field behind the barn, digging fence posts with his left arm, still weaker than his right. She brought him stew and sat on a stone beside the shovel. The stars were coming out again, soft and bright, unbothered by men and their wars. He took the bowl with a nod of thanks, not looking at her. If I had died that night in your snow, you'd still be standing here, raising your boys, planting your seeds, stronger than anyone gives you credit for. I wouldn't have, she said, because you would have taken a piece of us with you. Jameson stopped chewing. The silence stretched between them, longer than it should have. Then he set the bowl down, unfinished, and leaned his head back against the fence post. I've done things, he said at last, things I'll never be proud of, things I'd never want your boys to do, but when I lie awake at night, I think about how you looked the first morning I opened my eyes, like you'd just seen a ghost, or maybe saved one. You were half dead. You gave me life. They sat like that until the stars blinked into a fuller sky, and when he finally walked her back to the house, his arm brushed hers deliberately, gently, as if asking permission for something neither of them could name just yet. Days turned to weeks, and with each one the land softened under spring's touch. The garden bloomed, the hens laid again. Jonah found a litter of kittens in the barn and begged to keep two. Caleb and Jameson built a new hen house together, arguing over nails and beams like father and son, and slowly, without announcement or fanfare, Jameson moved from guest to fixture. His boots by the door, his cup on the shelf, his coat on the peg where Nathan's had once hung and never returned. One Sunday afternoon after church in the valley, where whispers still traveled faster than wagons, Ivy watched him speaking with Reverend Cole. Jonah clung to his hand, pointing at wildflowers. Caleb leaned against the wagon, looking up at the man who'd begun to teach him what it meant to be good without being perfect. They say he was a soldier on the other side, Mrs. Dandridge murmured, stepping beside Ivy. They say a lot of things, Ivy replied without looking at her. They say he's living in your house now, teaching your boys. He is? And you're not worried? Ivy finally turned, her gaze cool, only about how to thank God properly for sending him. That night, Jameson handed her a folded piece of paper, trembling, ink-stained. I wrote to my brother, he said, told him about the boys, about you. I didn't know you had family. Haven't seen him in years, not since before the war. He's a school teacher in Pennsylvania. Lives quiet. I don't know if he'll write back, but I thought maybe if we had someone. She folded the letter carefully and set it beside her, mending. We do. We have each other. The kiss happened in the rain, as thunder rolled low and comforting across the hills. Caleb had gone to fetch kindling. Jonah was asleep in the corner, with a kitten curled under his chin. Ivy was by the stove checking the bread. Jameson stood by the door watching the downpour like it might wash him clean. You're always listening for something, she said softly. Boots, gunfire, the past. It's not coming back. He turned, water dripping from his hair, and crossed the room without hesitation. He took her face in his hands, just like Nathan once had, but different. So different, gentle, hesitant, filled with questions instead of promises. She kissed him first. It tasted like rain and sorrow and second chances. That night they didn't speak of the future, didn't say what it meant. But when Caleb came home and found Jameson's coat on the back of the kitchen chair and didn't flinch when Jonah curled beside him the next morning during reading hour, Ivy knew it was real. They didn't need names or rings or church bells. They needed mornings like this. Bread baking, chores done. Laughter where silence had once lived. But letters did come. 2, to be exact. The first was from Jameson's brother, a carefully written message in perfect penmanship offering his blessings and a visit in the fall. The second was from the War Office. Nathan McAllister had been found in a prisoner camp near Atlanta. Identified. Confirmed. Buried. Official. The letter arrived with a pension form and a note of condolence. Ivy read it in silence, then set it beside the Bible on the shelf. She felt the weight of its truth, but not the shattering pain she had once imagined. The grief had already passed through her, left its scars. What remained now was acceptance. That night, as she stood outside watching the stars again, Jameson joined her. "You're free," he said softly. "I already was." He reached into his coat and pulled out a box. Inside, a simple ring, worn, old, engraved with initials she didn't recognize. "My mother's," he said. "She wanted me to give it to someone when I found a reason to come home." She took the ring and slipped it on her finger. The following spring, they held a small ceremony under the apple tree behind the barn. Reverend Cole presided. The boys wore matching suspenders. Jonah cried when Jameson knelt and called them his sons. Caleb didn't cry, but he stood tall, like the man of the house welcoming another. Years later, long after the war became history and the scars faded into memory, Jonah would tell his children about the man who came into their lives like a storm, broken and bleeding, and became their compass. And Ivy, seated on the porch with a baby in her arms and morning glories blooming across the railing, would write their story down in careful script, a story of wounds and healing, of strength and kindness, of a widow who had once saved a soldier, and the soldier who became her family's hero forever. Ivy rose before the sun the next morning, careful not to wake Jameson where he slept on the cot near the fire. Jonah's tiny feet were tangled in the quilt beside him, one arm draped protectively over his stuffed rabbit. Caleb lay stretched out on the floor in front of the hearth, snoring softly, the ashes casting a faint glow on his worn shirt. She pulled her shawl tight and slipped out into the brisk morning air, the sky still ink-dark with stars. The fields were quiet, save for the coo of a morning dove in the trees and the distant rush of the creek that marked their land's southern border. The world was beginning again, in its slow, careful way. And for the first time in what felt like years, Ivy wasn't afraid of what it might bring. The hens clucked restlessly when she opened the coop. She gathered the eggs in silence, her mind not on the morning's chores, but on the man inside her house, the man who had come to them in blood and silence, who had slowly become as necessary as breath. She had feared him, then tolerated him, then watched her boys adore him, and now she loved him, fiercely, without shame. She returned to the cabin just as the first light broke over the hills, her basket full. Jameson was already awake, stoking the fire. A kitten curled against his chest. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression softened. "Didn't hear you leave," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "You were dreaming," she replied, setting the basket down. "You smiled in your sleep." "Must have been the company," he said, his eyes crinkling. "Or maybe the kitten, likely both." The children stirred as the smell of bread and fried eggs filled the room. Jonah sat up first, hair a wild tangle, and immediately pounced on Jameson, claiming his spot in his lap. Caleb woke more slowly, rubbing his eyes and stretching, before taking his usual seat at the table. They ate together like a family, without speaking of it, without naming the fragile miracle it was. Later that week, Jameson received another letter from his brother, this one full of details, an offer of land in Pennsylvania, a small school in need of help, a town without too many memories. He handed the letter to Ivy and watched her read it. "Well?" she asked. "I told him I'd think about it." She nodded, folding the letter with care. "And are you?" "I've already decided." "Then why haven't you told me?" "Because I want you to decide too." She looked up at him, startled. "I won't leave if you won't," he said simply. "But if this land's too heavy with grief for you, if you want to start fresh somewhere, the boys don't have to remember what they lost every time the wind changes. I'd go." Ivy stared at him, the words pressing against her throat. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "This is our home," she said. "We built it, not from nothing, but from everything we thought we'd lost." He turned her hand over in his, kissed her palm. we stay," she whispered. "Together." They worked the land that spring like people with something to prove. The fences were mended. The barn got a fresh coat of whitewash. Jameson planted corn with Caleb and built a small footbridge for Jonah over the creek. Ivy taught them all to can vegetables and make soap from ash and lard. Life returned in the smallest, most persistent ways. In May, the neighbors came with hammers and saws. The McKinnons, the Dandridges, even Reverend Cole showed up with his grandsons to help raise a new roof on the henhouse. Ivy made lemonade. The boys chased chickens. Jameson stood on the ladder, hammer in hand, shouting instructions with the sure voice of someone who had learned how to lead without ever asking for it. That evening, as the stars came out and the fireflies began their slow dance across the fields, Ivy stood beside him and watched their home come to life around them. "Looks like a real farm again," he said. "It is a real farm. I mean a working one, prosperous, full." "It's always been full," she said, laying her head on his shoulder, "even when we had nothing." He turned and kissed her hair. "You gave me back everything, and you gave us back ourselves." One afternoon in early June, as thunderclouds brewed over the hills, Jameson rode into town with Caleb to collect feed. When they returned, it was with more than just supplies. The mayor had asked Jameson to consider serving as a magistrate, filling in for an aging judge who could no longer make the ride from county to county. "You'd be fair," the mayor had said, "and God knows we need fair more than anything these days." Jameson had laughed it off, but Ivy could see the way his eyes lit up. He had been running from titles for years, but this one fit him like an old coat. "What'd you say?" she asked as he tied the horse. "Said I'd think about it." "And are you?" He smiled. "I'm waiting for your vote." "You already have it." That summer passed in golden waves of work and laughter. Emma Dandridge came by often, helping Ivy with the garden, sneaking shy glances at Caleb, who was growing taller by the week. Jonah built a raft from salvaged wood and declared himself captain of the creek. Ivy spent quiet afternoons reading on the porch while Jameson whittled beside her, carving small animals for the children, each more detailed than the last. One evening, after dinner, Ivy found him kneeling beside the cedar chest at the foot of their bed, carefully laying something inside. "What is it?" He stood and smiled, brushing dust from his hands. "Just putting the past in its place." Inside the chest, she saw a bundle of letters, a photograph of his parents, and a folded Confederate flag. "I thought you burned that," she said quietly. "I did, in my mind. But I kept the cloth, to remind me who I don't want to be." She closed the lid and sat beside him on the bed. "I don't see him when I look at you," she said. "I see the man who taught my sons to believe again. They taught me first." By fall, the trees around the cabin flamed with color. The harvest was plentiful. The root cellar was full. Jonah had begun reading on his own, proud of every new word. Caleb was training a young colt Jameson had brought from town. Ivy stitched new curtains, and Jameson sat down to write. Every night, after the boys were in bed, he pulled out a leather-bound journal and recorded the day's events, weather, progress on the land, things the boys had said. But more than that, he wrote memories. The day Ivy first touched his hand, the moment he heard Caleb laugh after weeks of silence, the way Jonah curled up beside him during storms. "I want them to know," he said when Ivy caught him writing by lamplight. "If I'm ever gone, I want them to have more than just my story. I want them to have ours." She kissed him, then fiercely, pulling him close. "You're not going anywhere." The first snow arrived in November, soft and heavy, coating the world in quiet. The family spent the evening around the fire, playing cards, sipping cider, telling stories. Jameson carved a snowplow for Jonah. Ivy sewed Caleb a new scarf. The windows glowed with warmth. Outside, the world was cold. But inside their little cabin, love burned steady and bright. As she tucked Jonah into bed that night, Ivy whispered, Do you remember the night Mr. Jameson came to us? Jonah nodded, eyes already closing. He was bleeding. Yes, she said. And do you remember what you said to me the next morning? He frowned, thinking. I said, I hoped he'd stay. She kissed his forehead. He did, baby. He did. In the other room, Jameson stood at the window, watching the snow fall, one hand resting on the rifle he no longer needed. He had been a soldier, a wanderer, a ghost. Now he was a father, a husband, a hero to the only family that had ever truly claimed him. And as he turned toward the warmth of their home, he knew he had finally come all the way home. Winter deepened around them, blanketing the hills and fields in a quiet hush that softened every sound and slowed every step. Inside the little cabin, however, life stirred with warmth and motion. Ivy filled the pantry shelves with jars of preserves, and the boys hung dried apple slices over the hearth, threading them with cinnamon sticks and bits of ribbon. Jameson repaired the cracked window pane in the boys' room with salvaged glass from the old church up the road and reinforced the roof with Caleb's eager help. Each hammer strike felt like a heartbeat, solid and sure. They had survived 1 year together, the kind that doesn't just pass by, but redefines everything. Snow fell heavy on Christmas Eve. The cabin was filled with the smell of roasting venison and warm bread. Jonah wrapped his kitten in a sock he'd cut open and called it a coat. Caleb built a sled from scrap wood and begged Jameson to test it at first light. Ivy sat in her rocker, mending Jameson's coat, while he read from the Bible aloud in his low, even voice. She watched him as he read, how his fingers traced the edge of the page, how his lips moved gently over the familiar words. She wondered if the man who had bled in the snow 1 year ago would recognize the man before her now. She wasn't sure he would. She wasn't sure she would, either. Later that night, after the boys were asleep and the fire had died to coals, Jameson pulled a small box from his satchel. It was wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. He handed it to her with a smile that was almost shy. I didn't mean to wait until tonight, he said, his voice soft with the weight of the moment. She unwrapped it carefully, her fingers trembling just slightly. Inside was a silver locket, polished, plain. When she opened it, she found a folded scrap of parchment with 2 names written in his careful script, Caleb and Jonah. Turn it over, he murmured. She did, and her breath caught. The word etched into the silver was one she hadn't dared speak in months. Mother. I asked them, he said quietly, if they thought you should wear that word close to your heart. They said yes. They said they couldn't imagine you wearing anything else. Her fingers closed over the locket, pressing it to her chest. The tears came silently, slipping down her cheeks in rivulets warmed by the fire and by the man beside her who had turned her grief into something sacred. That night she slept with the locket on. When she dreamed, she saw Nathan, his kind eyes, his quiet strength, and he was smiling. Not with jealousy or sorrow, but with a strange kind of peace, as if he'd always known she would find her way forward. In the spring, they planted twice as many crops. Jameson taught Caleb how to use a surveying chain to map the land, and Jonah took over milking the goats with such pride he demanded a chore list of his own. Ivy found herself laughing more than she cried. There was still pain, still shadows, but they didn't rule her anymore. The townsfolk, once hesitant, now brought extra seeds and helped raise a small barn for the calf they'd purchased in March. Reverend Cole came every Sunday to sit with Jameson and Caleb on the porch, swapping stories about law, justice, and the intricacies of forgiveness. One day, near midsummer, a writer came with news. Jameson's name had been cleared. It turned out the old Confederate commander, who had once accused him of desertion, had died and left behind a confession. Jameson Boyd had not abandoned his post. He had defied a cruel order to burn a civilian village and fled the regiment to stop the atrocity. The papers included a letter of pardon, a commendation, and an invitation to testify at a congressional hearing on war conduct. Jameson read it twice before folding it carefully. "You were a hero even then," Ivy whispered. "No," he replied, "but I tried to be a man my mother would have been proud of. She wouldn't be the only one." That summer they took the boys to visit his brother in Pennsylvania. The trip was long, dusty, but filled with wonder. The boys had never seen a town with so many buildings or eaten bread from a bakery. Jameson's brother Ellis was taller and leaner, with kind eyes and a voice that rang like a school bell. He welcomed them as kin, called Ivy his sister before the week was out, gave the boys slates and chalk, and promised them books whenever they were ready. By fall, Ivy had begun writing again. She filled page after page with her story, not because she thought anyone would read it, but because she needed to remember every small moment, every brush with grace. Jameson built her a desk by the window. Caleb started talking about attending college one day. Jonah wanted to be a carpenter, or a soldier, or both. Ivy just wanted more days, more mornings with pancakes and kittens, more evenings with the smell of wood smoke in her hair and the weight of Jameson's hand in hers. And she got them, not forever. No one gets forever, but she got enough. One golden afternoon, years later, Ivy stood on the porch with her gray-streaked hair pinned in a loose bun. She watched her grandson, a toddling thing with his father's grin, chase a chicken through the yard. Jonah called out from the barn, laughing as he dropped hay into the stall, while Caleb leaned against the fence, arguing over prices with a merchant from town. Jameson stepped beside her, slower now, a cane in his right hand again, not from wounds, but from years. "Do you remember the snow?" she asked. "All of them." "The first one?" He nodded. "It nearly killed me. It saved you. It did more than that." She reached for his hand. "It gave us this." They stood in silence, watching the sun set over the fields they had made fertile with hope. Behind them, the cabin buzzed with life, pots bubbling, children squealing, laughter rising like smoke. In a drawer inside, wrapped in linen and cedar chips, rested a silver locket. Inside it were 3 names now: Caleb, Jonah, and Hope, their daughter. The one they never expected, the one who came after the hardest storms, the one whose middle name was Grace. Their story was never about a miracle. It was about a woman who refused to let death have the last word, and the soldier who became her proof that even shattered things could be made whole again. Forever. The wind swept through the valley with the scent of wild sage and distant rain, rippling the tall grasses that had grown thick with summer's generosity. Ivy stood at the edge of the garden, her apron heavy with squash and carrots, the sun warm on her shoulders. Behind her, the cabin buzzed with the usual hum of late afternoon, Jonah's laughter, the scrape of Caleb's boots on the barn ladder, Jameson's low whistle as he sharpened tools on the porch. It was the kind of day that had once felt impossible, too good, too peaceful, too whole. She carried the harvest inside and set it on the kitchen table just as Jameson came in, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes still sharp despite the fine lines that time had etched around them. "I saw the horse come back with no rider," he said, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Jonah fall off again?" "Jumped," she replied, amused. "Said he wanted to feel the wind on his face." Jameson shook his head. That boy was born without fear. "Or sense," Caleb added, stepping in behind them with a coil of rope over his shoulder. He dropped it near the door and leaned over the table to snatch a carrot. "Said he's going to ride bareback to the river this weekend." "He's 13, Ivy said. "Let him dream." "Let him break something, more like," Caleb muttered, but his grin betrayed his affection. Dinner was quiet in the way of old families. Conversation folded neatly between spoonfuls of stew and slices of cornbread. The children, now no longer children, discussed fencing repairs and the upcoming county fair. Jameson listened more than he spoke, watching them with a pride that filled the room like sunlight. After the meal, Ivy slipped outside alone, needing the cool air and the hush of twilight. The porch creaked beneath her feet, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The hills rolled out before her, golden in the dying light. She could hear the creek below, the low murmur of water on stone, and the soft rustle of trees whispering secrets to the stars. She didn't hear Jameson approach until he sat beside her. "You're thinking again?" he said. "Always." "About what?" She hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out an old letter, creased, worn, soft at the edges. Nathan's last note. The one they'd found years after he died in that southern camp. She'd kept it tucked away, not because she needed it, but because she hadn't quite known what to do with it. "I think I'm ready to let it go," she said. Jameson took it, read it silently, and then handed it back. "You already did," he said. "You just didn't know it." Ivy held the letter a moment longer before walking to the edge of the porch. The lantern by the door flickered in the wind, casting long shadows across the steps. She struck a match, touched it to the edge of the letter, and watched the flames curl and eat their way through the paper. The ashes floated into the sky like tiny ghosts, vanishing into the starlight. When she turned back, Jameson had his arms open, waiting. She went to him, rested her head against his shoulder. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't opened that door?" she whispered. "No," he said, kissing her temple, "because I believe I still would have found you, even if it had taken me 1,000 lifetimes." And Ivy, who had once believed in nothing but survival, closed her eyes and believed him. The Morning Glory Ranch stood tall and steady beneath the moon, the wind singing lullabies through the trees. Inside, their children prepared for tomorrow, Jonah mapping out his riding path, Caleb brushing down the horses, Hope humming softly as she folded laundry, with hands too small for all the good they held. And in the quiet of that night, Ivy and Jameson sat hand in hand, two stories wound together so tightly they could no longer be undone. Because once, long ago, an abandoned widow had opened her door to a dying man, and in saving him, she had saved them all. Spring returned to the valley with a softness Ivy had almost forgotten. The air was scented with plum blossoms and damp earth, and the creek sang louder than it had in months, tumbling over polished stones with joyful abandon. The hills wore a fresh green coat, and wildflowers nodded along every fence line. Life had begun again, not in dramatic declarations, but in small, sure signs. Lambs in the pasture, chicks in the coop, laughter drifting from the porch as Jonah teased Hope about her handwriting. Ivy moved slower now, not from age, but from contentment. She had learned to savor things, mornings especially. She would rise early, wrap her shawl over her nightdress, and sit by the window with her tea, watching as Jameson walked the perimeter with Caleb. They didn't talk much on those walks. They didn't need to. Their understanding was long-rooted, as solid as the oaks that framed their land. Hope joined them sometimes, barefoot and bright-eyed, asking questions about weather patterns and fence knots and how to tell if a cow was expecting. Jameson always answered with patience, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as they walked. Ivy sometimes watched them through misted eyes, the pain of old losses softened by the balm of new blessings. Jonah had taken to woodcarving with an intensity that reminded Ivy of his father. Both of them, she thought, William and Jameson, had passed down their skill through steady hands and hearts that understood the language of quiet creation. Jonah's pieces lined the mantel now, horses, birds, even a replica of their old cabin, each detail carved with love and care. One afternoon Ivy sat with her journal open, the pages nearly filled now. She had written every memory she could recall, some painful, others so tender they made her hand tremble. Stories of that bitter winter, of the wounded soldier who'd become their anchor, of the boys growing into men under the firm and gentle hand of the man they now called Father without hesitation. Hope leaned over her shoulder, reading the last few lines aloud. "You think this'll matter to someone?" she asked. "It matters to us," Ivy replied. "That's enough." Jameson stepped into the room then, a letter in his hand. His brows were lifted, curious. "From your brother," he said, handing it over. "He wants to come visit this summer. Bring his grandchildren." "Does he?" Ivy smiled, touched by the thought. "We'll need more beds. We'll build them." "Think the barn can host another dance?" she teased. "With the right kind of music," he said, drawing her close. She pressed a kiss to his cheek, and he leaned into it like it still surprised him after all these years. Later that evening, they sat on the porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and gold. The boys were cleaning tools by the barn. Hope was inside baking, her face smudged with flour. The scent of cinnamon floated through the windows. Jameson took Ivy's hand. "Do you ever miss what might have been?" he asked. She thought for a long moment. "No," she said, "because what we have is what should have been." He nodded. "You gave me more than a second chance, Ivy. You gave me a life. And you gave me back my heart." The wind shifted, rustling the morning glories that now wound around every post of the porch. They had grown thick and wild, curling toward the sky with bold defiance, their blooms unfurling each day as if to remind the world beauty always returns. They sat in the stillness, wrapped in a love that had been tested and proven, forged in fire and made strong through choice. And as the stars blinked into the heavens one by one, Ivy closed her eyes and breathed deep. She had once opened her door to a dying man, and now she lived in the heart of everything she'd ever hoped for. A home rebuilt, a family reborn, a love that would echo forever in the valley they had made their own. 3 weeks after the letter from Ivy's brother arrived, their farm bustled like a summer gathering long before guests had even arrived. Jameson, ever practical, had already drawn up plans for the extra bunkhouse they'd need, and the boys set to work with eager hands, hammering and sawing late into the long, golden evenings. Caleb, now 17 and broad-shouldered like Jameson, took to leading the work while Jonah managed the detailed finishing, trim, doors, window frames, all carved with the same quiet precision he gave his sculptures. Hope was deep into a sewing project she refused to let anyone see. "It's a surprise," she told her mother with a conspiratorial grin, her fingers stained with thread dye and her skirts perpetually dusted with snippets of muslin. The house, already filled with life, stretched to make room for more. Meals were heartier, laughter rang louder. Even the animals seemed to sense the shift. The goats bleated eagerly when the children passed, the chickens clucked along with the morning routine, and the horses lifted their heads when Jameson walked out to the pasture as though they too had come to rely on his steadiness. Then came the news no one expected. Jameson came home from town with the telegram in his coat pocket. His expression gave nothing away, but Ivy knew something was wrong the moment he stepped through the door. He kissed her cheek gently, murmured a greeting to Hope, who was setting bread to rise, and went straight out to the barn. Ivy followed after him, drying her hands on her apron. He was staring at the grain bins when she came in, the paper clutched in his hand. "It's my regiment," he said quietly. "They've requested my presence back east. The congressional inquiry's opening testimony begins in August." She reached for the telegram. It was brief, formal. "Your record and testimony are critical to the investigation into wartime conduct during the Shenandoah campaign. Please advise of earliest availability." Ivy's throat tightened. "You'd be gone how long?" 3 months, maybe more. Silence stretched between them like a sudden canyon. The war was long over, but its shadow still lingered in places, folded into the hearts of the men who returned from it. Jameson rarely spoke of the things he had witnessed, even less of what he had done. But sometimes, when he thought she was asleep, she heard his whispered prayers, heard the names he still carried like stones in his chest. "Do you want to go?" she asked softly. He turned to her, eyes tired. "No, but I owe it to the men who didn't come home, to the families still wondering what happened, and if telling the truth helps." "You have to go." He nodded, throat working. "I'll miss everything. We'll write." "We always write," he said, brushing his knuckles down her cheek, "but I'll miss hearing your voice." She pressed her hand over his heart. "You'll hear it. Every time the wind comes off the hills, every time you smell clover or fresh bread. I'm with you, Jameson, always." He left 2 weeks later, just after dawn, with a promise to be careful and a satchel of supplies Hope had packed for him. Dried apple slices, biscuits, jerky, a flask of strong coffee. Caleb and Jonah rode with him to the station. Ivy and Hope watched from the hill, arms wrapped around each other as the train pulled away. When they returned, the house felt quieter. Not empty, but changed. Jameson wrote every 3 days, without fail. Long letters full of detail, about the hearings, about the people he met, about the old faces he never thought he'd see again. He signed every letter with the same words. "Tell the children I love them. Tell them I carry them with me. And tell their mother I count the days until I return to her arms." Ivy read each one aloud by lantern light. Hope copied parts of them into her sketch journal, decorating the pages with hearts and clumsy daisies. Caleb and Jonah rarely said much, but their eyes always softened when they listened. The house stayed warm because they kept it so. Still, Ivy couldn't help counting days. 1 month passed, then 2. The 3rd brought an unexpected silence. No letter. Then a 2nd week. Nothing. On the 17th day of silence, a courier rode up with a telegram in his saddlebag. The message was short. "Accident. Train derailment. En route home. Jameson injured. Stable but unconscious. Await further updates." The room spun. Hope screamed when Ivy read the note aloud. Caleb punched the doorframe so hard he split the skin on his knuckles. Jonah just stood there, his fists clenched, his shoulders trembling. By that evening, Ivy had packed a bag and made arrangements. She would go to him. She had to. But Caleb, tall, calm, Caleb stopped her at the door. "Let me go, Mama." "You can't. He needs someone strong enough to carry him home, if it comes to that," Caleb said, voice raw. "You need to stay with Hope and Jonah. I'll bring him back, I promise." She wanted to argue, but something in his eyes silenced her. William's steadiness lived in that boy. So did Jameson's courage. She kissed his forehead, pressed the telegram into his pocket, and whispered, "Bring him home." 2 weeks passed with aching slowness. Then, one crisp October morning, Ivy stood on the porch and saw 2 riders approaching. One was Caleb. The other, slouched in the saddle, hat low, arm in a sling, was Jameson. She ran to meet them, skirts flying. He was thinner, paler, but his eyes were still the same. He caught her as she reached him, burying his face in her neck, shaking with silent tears. "Thought I'd never see this place again," he murmured. "You're home," she whispered. "You're home, and I'll never let you go." The boys helped him into the house, and Ivy tucked him into the big bed, just as she had that first time years ago. She mixed her herbal teas, changed his bandages, read to him by firelight. Hope refused to leave his side, sleeping in a chair beside him, holding his good hand like a lifeline. Each day, his strength returned. Each day, Ivy watched the man she loved heal again, not just from wounds, but from the ghosts of war and loss. And when winter finally came, blanketing the valley in silence and snow, the house rang with laughter once more. The morning glories were gone for the season, but their seeds lay deep in the soil, waiting, as always, to bloom again. Jameson spent that winter in a quiet rhythm of recovery. The injury to his shoulder had been worse than Ivy first thought. A fractured collarbone, deep bruising across his ribs, and a stubborn weakness in his right hand. He hated being still, hated watching others chop the wood, repair the fencing, and haul grain. But he also knew the price of ignoring pain. So he listened to Ivy when she told him to rest, and he let the boys take the lead even when it chafed. Jonah made him a cane, beautifully carved from maple wood, with a handle shaped like a hawk's head. Jameson didn't want to use it at first, but when Hope presented a matching one for Ivy, declaring them the king and queen of Morning Ridge, he laughed so hard he coughed and had to lie back down. Caleb handled the livestock as though he'd been born to it. He moved through the herds with calm confidence, nodding greetings to each animal, inspecting hooves and feed like Jameson once had. Jonah took over the repairs, his strong hands fixing hinges, sharpening blades, sanding worn edges smooth again. Hope ran the kitchen and the household, her soft voice giving orders that somehow didn't sound like orders at all. Jameson spent his days at the window, watching them, pride swelling like a tide inside him. His family had not fallen apart in his absence. They had grown stronger, more capable, more connected, and it broke something open in his chest to realize they were no longer just his to protect. They were his to learn from, too. One evening, as the wind howled through the eaves and snow curled like lace around the windows, Ivy brought him the leather-bound journal she'd been writing in since he left. "It's all here," she said, setting it in his lap. "Every day you were gone, every day we waited, every letter, every fear, every joy." He opened it slowly. Her handwriting filled every page, neat even when her heart must have been in pieces. He ran his fingers over the ink, tracing her words like a man remembering the sound of music after too long without it. "You carried me," he whispered. "We carried each other," she replied. Later, when the fire burned low and the children were asleep, he read one entry aloud. It was from the day the telegram had arrived, the day they'd learned he was hurt. "Hope and I held each other in the kitchen and prayed out loud like we hadn't done in years. Jonah sat on the floor with his carving knife and worked until his hands bled. Caleb didn't say anything at all. He just left the room and came back with his coat. He said, 'He needs us.' And then he went. That's the kind of man he's become. That's the kind of father you've been to him." Jameson closed the book and set it gently aside. Then he took Ivy's hand and held it over his heart. "Marry me again," he said softly. She smiled. "We're already married. Marry me again anyway. This time with all of them standing beside us. Not because we have to, but because we choose to. Again and again. Every day." She leaned forward and kissed him. "Yes," she whispered. "Always yes." The spring thaw came late that year, but when it did, the hills turned green so quickly it was like someone had unrolled a carpet of life. The creek roared with meltwater, and the lambs pranced like dancers through the new grass. On the first warm day of April, they held the wedding beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of the pasture. Hope wore a crown of morning glories. Jonah played the fiddle. Caleb stood at Jameson's side, tall and steady. When Ivy stepped into view wearing a dress made of soft ivory cotton and a smile that lit the world, Jameson felt tears slip down his cheeks. He wasn't embarrassed. This love was worthy of tears. They said their vows again, hands clasped, voices sure. "I choose you again, in joy and in sorrow, in strength and in weakness, in every season." Afterward, the community gathered in the barn, dancing long into the night. Lanterns swayed from the rafters. Pies disappeared from the table faster than Ivy could count. Caleb laughed louder than he had in years. Jonah pulled Hope into a dance, and she didn't even pretend to be embarrassed. Jameson and Ivy sat on the porch swing as the music drifted out over the fields. He held her hand in his, thumb stroking her knuckles. "I don't want to miss any more of this," he said. "You won't," she promised. In the months that followed, Jameson healed slowly. His shoulder never regained full strength, but he adapted. He taught with his left hand. He learned to shoot from his hip instead of his shoulder. He let the boys lead when he needed to. And he never missed a single school recital, church picnic, or community meeting again. They became a family known for their generosity. Their table was always full, their doors always open. When a neighbor's barn burned, they were the first to help rebuild. When a widow needed seed for her spring planting, it was Hope who brought the sacks in a borrowed wagon. When a traveling preacher came through with nothing but dust on his boots and a broken hymn book, Jonah carved him a new cover and gave him his own guitar. One night, as summer faded into fall, Ivy and Jameson sat by the fire with their children gathered close. Jonah had finished a new carving, a scene of a family around a table, light spilling through a window, morning glories climbing the walls. "It's us," Hope said softly. "Do you remember," Ivy asked, "what I used to say when we had nothing but faith and a little garden?" "You said love makes room," Caleb replied. "And look what it made," Jameson added. "A home, a life, a legacy." Outside, the wind moved gently through the grass. The stars blinked awake one by one. And inside, where the fire crackled and love wrapped around every word, every glance, every breath, the story of a wounded soldier and an abandoned widow lived on. Because in the end he hadn't just become her children's hero, he had become their father, their heart, their home forever. The days after the wedding renewal settled into a gentle rhythm, as if the land itself had breathed a sigh of relief. Ivy often found herself waking before dawn, not from habit or worry, but from peace. The kind of peace that settled in the bones and made a person believe that good things could last. The boys took to their work with more enthusiasm than ever, not because they were told, but because they belonged to this place now. Morning Ridge wasn't just a home anymore. It was theirs, earned, built, defended. They worked the land like it pulsed beneath their feet, every post driven into the soil, a promise to stay. Hope planted morning glories at the base of every fence post, giggling when Jameson warned her they'd grow wild and take over everything. "That's the idea," she said. "Beauty should be everywhere." She started drawing, too, sketching the animals, the trees, her brothers' faces when they laughed, her mother sewing by the firelight. Ivy watched the pages of her daughter's notebook fill up with more than pictures. They were love letters in graphite and ink. Jonah crafted a new cradle in the barn workshop, sturdy oak, lined with pine, carved with vines and birds. Ivy found him one afternoon bent over it with such concentration he didn't hear her enter. She waited, watching the care in his movements, the way he whispered something to himself every time he brushed away a curl of wood shavings. When he finally looked up and saw her, his cheeks turned red. "It's for the future," he said simply. "In case." She nodded, understanding. Her son was thinking about the next chapter already, carving space for it with every stroke of his knife. Jameson, for his part, seemed reborn. He still carried a limp, and his shoulder would never be quite right, but there was light in him now. He spent mornings riding the perimeter, tipping his hat to neighbors, talking with Caleb about planting rotations and crop schedules. He spent afternoons with Jonah in the workshop or reading aloud to Hope under the cottonwoods, but it was the evenings Ivy cherished most. After supper, when the dishes were cleaned and the candles lit, they'd sit together on the porch swing. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes Jameson would tell stories about his childhood, how he'd learned to fish in a muddy creek with a broken rod, how his mother used to sing to the hens to get them to lay better eggs. Ivy told stories, too, about her father's fiddle, her mother's quilting, the time Jonah had gotten stuck in the grain bin, and Hope had tried to dig him out with a soup ladle. They laughed often. They cried sometimes, but mostly they sat in the quiet certainty of each other, until one afternoon a letter arrived from Washington. The inquiry Jameson had testified in was being finalized. The committee wanted to recognize him formally for his honesty, for his service, for the way he'd returned to a quiet life without bitterness or blame. There was to be a ceremony. They wanted him to speak. Jameson folded the letter slowly, his expression unreadable. "Will you go?" Ivy asked. He stared at the hearth for a long moment. I don't know. Why not? He sighed. Because I already have what matters. This place, you, the children. What could they give me that I don't already have? You don't go for you, she said gently. You go for the men who didn't make it home, for the ones who can't speak for themselves, for the man you were when you walked into our lives bleeding and lost. He deserves this. Jameson left 3 weeks later with Ivy's shawl packed in his saddlebag and a carved token from each of the children. He promised to be back before the first snow. He returned with more than medals. He returned with a letter from the president himself, with photographs of the ceremony, with the folded flag of a fallen comrade he'd promised to deliver to a mother waiting in silence. But most of all, he returned with peace, real peace, the kind that only comes when a man has laid down the last burden he's carried for too long. Winter arrived with fierce winds and deep snowdrifts, but Morning Ridge held strong. The new barn roof didn't leak. The root cellar stayed full. The firewood stacks never ran out. Inside the house, laughter curled through every room. Jonah finished the cradle. Caleb took on a winter apprenticeship with the town veterinarian. Hope announced she wanted to write a book one day, a real one, with all their stories in it. You should, Ivy said. The world needs to remember. As the snow fell outside, Jameson gathered the children near the fire and opened a book of his own. It was the one Ivy had written in all those years ago, the one she'd handed him when she thought he might not make it home again. He added pages now, new entries, written in his slow, careful hand. December 12th. Jonah presented me with a finished cradle. Carved initials in the headboard. MG for Morning Glory. Told him I'd rock every grandchild we're blessed with right there. December 24th. Hope drew the family as animals. I'm a bear, Ivy's an owl, Jonah's a fox. Caleb's a wolf. She made herself a hummingbird. Told me it was because hummingbirds never forget the way home. January 3rd. Told Ivy I never believed in fate, but I believe in her. By the time spring returned, Morning Ridge was more than just a homestead. It was a sanctuary, a refuge, a living testament to what could grow when kindness met courage, when faith met choice, when a wounded man was given a second chance and decided not to waste it. And in the middle of it all stood Ivy, once an abandoned widow, now a wife, a mother, a heart beating at the center of everything good. One night, long after the lanterns were blown out and the stars scattered across the sky, Ivy rose quietly and went to the porch. She found Jameson there, wrapped in a quilt, watching the horizon. Couldn't sleep? She asked. He shook his head. Just counting my blessings. She sat beside him, resting her head on his good shoulder. They're many, she said. Yes, he whispered. They are. And every one of them started the day you opened that door. They sat there until the sky paled with morning, and the first light touched the fields with gold. The morning glories would bloom soon, and with them the next season of their story. The morning glories had returned by the first week of May. Ivy stood barefoot in the garden, watching the sun stretch across the hills, gold spilling like honey over the soft earth. Her hands rested on her hips, and her apron flapped gently in the breeze. Jameson was already up, somewhere down by the pasture with Jonah, checking the fencing that had been weakened during the last storm. Caleb had taken the wagon into town for supplies. Hope was still asleep upstairs, exhausted from a late night helping Ivy prepare the early planting schedule. The house was quiet, just the way it had been in the earliest days, though now the silence was full, not empty. It carried the hum of a life well lived, of memories layered like stone and soil, each one grounding the next. She walked along the fence, fingers trailing over the fresh green leaves of the vines curling along the posts. Small buds were already forming, their promise tucked tight inside. Ivy smiled. She understood promise. She understood what it took to protect something until it was ready to bloom. That afternoon, she heard hammering from the barn and found Jameson and Jonah bent over a new build. Not a shed, not a crib, something else. "What are you two up to?" she asked, leaning in the doorway, the scent of hay and cedar wrapping around her like a memory. Jonah looked up, grinning. "A bench." "A bench?" "For the hilltop," Jameson added. "The one where you and I watched the fireflies that night we thought we'd lose the wheat field." She remembered, the night the drought had finally broken, and the rain came down so hard it sounded like the sky itself was weeping. They'd stood side by side, drenched and laughing, too tired to cry. "I thought it deserved a view," he said. Ivy stepped forward and traced the top rail of the bench. It was smooth, carefully sanded, with curling details of morning glories etched into the edges. "You boys and your carvings," she whispered. "We want something that lasts," Jonah said quietly. That evening they hauled it to the hill together. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. Caleb met them at the top with lemonade and fresh bread, and Hope joined with her notebook, claiming she needed the perfect light for drawing. They sat on the bench in a row, Ivy in the center, Jameson beside her, their children on either side. No one spoke for a long time. Then Hope said, "Mama, did you ever think it would turn out like this?" "No," Ivy answered, "but I always hoped." "Do you remember the night we found Jameson?" "How could I forget?" Hope turned to him, her face bright with emotion. "You scared me. You looked like death itself. But you said thank you before you passed out. I never forgot that." "You saved my life," Jameson said. Hope tilted her head. "You saved ours." They sat until the stars came out, until the crickets tuned their song, until the wind rose soft and steady over the hills. Then they walked home, leaving the bench behind. A week later, a letter came from a distant cousin Ivy hadn't heard from in years. It was an invitation to speak at a historical society meeting in Denver. They were gathering first-hand accounts of frontier families, stories of survival, legacy, resilience. "Me?" Ivy asked, eyebrows raised as she read the letter aloud. "They want me to speak?" "Of course they do," Jameson said. "No one tells a story better." She hesitated. "What would I even say?" That love saved a man's life, and then he stayed to build something beautiful with the family that saved him. Ivy ran her fingers over the letter, thoughtful. The next week they hitched the wagon and made the trip together. All of them. The children packed their best clothes. Hope brought her sketchbook, and Jonah wrapped the bench's blueprint in canvas, just in case someone asked what they were most proud of. At the meeting, Ivy stood before a crowded room, her hands shaking slightly, and told their story. Not the sanitized version, not just the parts that made people smile, but the whole truth. She spoke of losing William, of hunger and fear, of prayers whispered into the floorboards of a cabin so thin you could see your breath by lamplight. She spoke of Jameson bleeding in her wheat field, and how kindness doesn't always look convenient. She spoke of what they'd built together, of the way love had arrived not with roses, but with a bullet wound and a name whispered in the dark. When she finished, the room was silent. Then came the applause. Afterward, a woman approached her, weeping quietly. "My son didn't make it home," she said. "But your story gives me hope that someone else's boy found his peace." Ivy embraced her, holding tight. Back at Morning Ridge, life carried on. Spring gave way to summer, and the vines bloomed more furiously than ever. Hope's drawings began appearing in the local paper. Jonah received a commission to carve a memorial for the town square. Caleb, after much thought, applied to veterinary school. Jameson beamed when he read the acceptance letter. And Ivy, for the first time in years, picked up her quilting again. She stitched late into the night, fabric stretched across her lap, each square a memory, a prayer, a quiet declaration that life, no matter how bruised, could be beautiful again, One morning, as the sun rose over the hills and the fields danced in the wind, Ivy stood at the fence and watched her family begin another day. Jameson walked toward her from the barn, his gait still uneven, but his posture strong. He carried a mug of coffee in each hand. "Everything okay?" he asked, handing her one. She nodded. "Just thinking." "Dangerous business," he teased. "Thinking how it all started with a knock at the door." He leaned on the fence beside her. "I didn't think I'd survive that night." "I didn't think we'd survive that winter." "But we did," he said, "because you said yes." She turned toward him, her heart full. "No, Jameson, because you stayed." He kissed her forehead, and together they watched the morning unfold. Cattle lowing in the distance, birds singing, Hope laughing across the yard, Jonah hauling lumber, Caleb saddling a horse for a neighbor boy who wanted to learn. A quiet life, a full one, and every bit of it earned by the choice to believe in something more, by the choice to stay, by the choice to love forever.